at the skull right here. Now on the skull, we see the skull region right here, and we're going to see that there are going to be a lot of holes called the foramens. Now in terms of the skull, we have parts that are part of the cranium and part of the facial bones. The cranial bones include the frontal bone right here. And the frontal bone we can tell because you see this kind of what looks like little suture, right, separating this bone from the bones behind it. Now this is called the coronal suture, and a coronal suture is like a coronal cut. A coronal cut cuts you into front or anterior and back or posterior. So a coronal cut cuts everything we're cutting into front and back. Now, when we look back here, you see another suture. It should be a line right around here. All right, and that line right here, you can see it a little bit better from this angle. That line cuts the skull into left and right halves. This is called a sagittal suture. And if we have a cut right down the middle, that's a type of cut we call a sagittal cut. A sagittal cut cuts everything we're cutting into left and right halves. All right? So when we're looking at the skull, anything anterior to the coronal suture, that's a frontal bone. The frontal bone comes all the way down here, and it helps form the superior margin of your orbit. And here's your orbit. Superior margin, you're going to have a hole here called the supraorbital foramen. So supra for superior, orbital for the orbit. So it's superior to the orbit, foramen means hole. So here's the supraorbital foramen. And then you see this tough ridge right on the very top of this right here. All right, and it's above the orbit again. This is called a supraorbital ridge or supraorbital meatus, sometimes called. Next, as we go back here, here's that coronal suture. Behind and posterior to the coronal suture, you'll see the parietal bone. So you have two parietal bones. The parietal bones are separated by the sagittal suture. Now these sutures are very large the younger we are. The older we get, the more likely these areas of the suture lines, they're going to dissolve. And if you become elderly, what we're going to see is that all these suture lines will disappear, and it'll be much harder to differentiate the type of bones we're going to see. Now, in terms of parietal bone, there's really nothing here in the parietal bone to kind of, besides just knowing the bone itself that you would need to know. Now, the next thing we need to look at here is a suture that is found between this bone and the parietal bone. This is called a squamous suture. The bone itself is called your temporal bone. So if you imagine where your temples are and you might have a headache, it's immediately posterior to your eye, and it's basically where your ear is. So this is a temporal bone right here, and there's some very interesting facets of this temporal bone. Number one, you see the opening from the outside. This is called the external auditory meatus, sometimes external acoustic meatus. That is the opening to your ear canal. Down here, you see what looks like a very sharp point. This is called the styloid process. Now, it looks sharp right now, but when we are actually alive and we have muscles there, there's going to be lots of muscles that are going to attach here. And usually the muscles are going to help move the tongue or the throat. Again, part of the temporal bone. All right, now you have this area, and in some people and models, you can see it a lot. You see the connection between this aspect, this process, as it makes contact with this bone. The bone itself is called the zygomatic bone right here. This part of it is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. We're going to see these two areas fuse together, and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone will bond over here with the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. What else do we see? All right, if you feel, and you can actually feel this right behind your ear, there's this kind of knobby area right here, right behind your ear, right? This is called a mastoid process. Mastoid process is important because a lot of muscles attach here, muscles that allows you to move your head in one direction or the other. The sternocleidomastoids, there's one, right? But there's a couple more we'll discuss later on. But this is also part of the temporal bone. Later on, we're going to see when we look inside, there are other holes that are found only on the internal aspects that we can see. All right, so let's take a look at the posterior aspect. Right, posteriorly, we're going to see that there's going to be another suture line here. And it almost forms like a Y, right? And it starts over here, comes down, and that's called the rhomboid suture. The rhomboid suture is going to separate, the rhomboid suture over here is going to separate the parietal bone from the most posterior bone called the occipital bone. The occipital bone is going to have a very thick nuchal line region right here, right? This whole area you can feel in the back of your skull, back of your head. And it's a very thick region where you're going to have muscles attached here, like the trapezius muscle. These are very big, strong muscles. So it kind of makes sense. You have a very thick, strong region where it goes into the bone itself, right? What else do we notice in the occipital bone is that you have a very huge opening. That's an opening for your brainstem as it exits and becomes a spinal cord. All right, this opening is called the foramen magnum. Now, besides the foramen magnum, right, on the anterior surface of it, you see two real kind of smooth areas right here. These are called the occipital condyles. These areas will make contact with your first cervical vertebrae, and it's going to allow for a nice, easy movement and sliding of your skull in a yes formation. Down here and over here, we'll talk about later on some of the holes that we see on the underside.